Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. And today's video is actually a change from the topic that I had originally planned to cover this week. I will be doing this week's video next week and a different video today. And the reason for the change is because of a comment that I actually received on last week's video. The one about those 6 executions that took place at Smithfield on the 30th of July 1540. In the comments section beneath that video, Javier asked me what I meant when I talked about the fact that Queen Elizabeth I appeared to be keen to find a middle way in matters of faith at the start of her reign, but that arguably this may not have remained the case throughout. And I was all set to respond with a link to another one of my videos that I was absolutely sure would have this question's answer covered. Except I soon found that I didn't have one that would actually do the job. And so this video is intended to fix that situation. But first, I want to say an absolutely massive thank you to Serious Readers for both sponsoring this video and for very kindly sending me one of their high-definition table lights to test out. Something that I've discovered over time about my dyslexia is that there can be such a thing as the wrong kind of light, and especially there can be the wrong kind of light to paper relationship. So, for example, take a glossy magazine, trying to read that in very bright light, whether that light is artificial or natural, that is probably the worst case scenario for me. And so, of course, the flip side of that is when I attempt to find low light conditions to read in, and that creates a different problem, because reading in low light strains my eyes and gives me headaches. This table light uses something called daylight wavelength technology. This is an LED light technology that is intended to closely mimic natural daylight. But for my purposes, I'd say this is actually better than daylight because it lets me adjust the beam width, how bright the lamp is, and also the angle that it points at. And believe you me, you can't do that with the sun. With this lamp, I can create a custom dyslexia-friendly light setting for me to read in, but I can also adjust it as my reading time goes on to compensate when my eyes start to feel strained. I have also used this lamp at full brightness and in tight focus when I've needed to thread a needle to sew a button back onto a shirt. Check out the link in my description box for more information and to order your own Serious Light. And when you are doing so, don't forget to use the offer code RTP22 at checkout so that you can get a free compact light with any purchase in the Serious Lights range. Thanks again to Serious Readers for collaborating with me on this video. And now let's explore what I was talking about when I mentioned Elizabeth's apparently shifting ideas in matters of faith. When Queen Elizabeth I ascended to the English throne in 1558, she would no doubt have been intimately aware of the dangerously divisive effects that had come from the shifting demands in state religion that had occurred during the reigns of her father and siblings. And certainly, it's fair to point out that Elizabeth would have had little memory of actually living through the chaos and violence that related to one of the first crises, the Pilgrimage of Grace, which happened in 1536 to 1537. I still think it's very likely that she would have heard about it. She would have learned how some of her father's subjects chose to respond to aspects of his Reformation by, as he would have seen it, breaking out in traitorous rebellion against him. In her brother Edward VI's reign, the drive towards evangelical reform went further than her father would ever have allowed, because, among other things, the chantries were dissolved, the Act of 6 Articles was repealed, and a Book of Common Prayer was introduced. This book would transform the way that the people were expected to worship. Edward's government would be threatened by the Prayer Book Rebellion as a result of these latter changes. There was discontent between court factions, and on top of this, all-out fights within the family unit itself, all as a result of these faith-based shifts. Edward and his elder half-sister Mary were said to have enjoyed a beautifully close and loving relationship for much of their lives. However, they were also reportedly both reduced to angry fits of tears after disputing with each other on the matter of religion. When Edward fell ill with the sickness that would ultimately kill him, he would decide, or be convinced, that Mary was unfit to be his successor, and so he would set about constructing his devise for the succession, which would sidestep Mary and Elizabeth in favour of their first cousin once removed, Lady Jane Grey. Faith difference is clearly one of the core factors that almost cost both Mary and Elizabeth their place in the succession, at the very least. As it was, Jane's rule would quickly fall apart and Mary would take the throne. Less than a year later, Jane would be executed. Mary, for her part, was quick to set about returning England into obedience with Rome and also into finding a way to provide her nation with a Roman Catholic heir of her own body, and to do so, she made a marriage with Philip of Spain. This marriage proved to be unpopular enough to spark rebellion, as we saw in the case of the Wyatt Rebellion. In the aftermath of Wyatt's uprising, Elizabeth was placed as a prisoner in the Tower of London because she was suspected of complicity in the plot, and although she was ultimately released, for the rest of her sister's reign she was surveilled, suspected, and in grave danger. In the meantime, the Marian regime was busy burning hundreds of heretics, as they were deemed to be by the government of the day. The number to be executed in this way is still debated, but a death toll of around 300 people is a number that is commonly offered. I don't think that I'm overstating things when I say that following the back and forth of Henry's 36-year reign, followed by Edward's 6-year one, then Jane's 9 days, and finally Mary's 5 years, that when it came to be Elizabeth's turn, she inherited the throne of a nation that was in utter, absolute turmoil. And perhaps this may go some way to explain why, at the start of her reign, she appears to have sought out a middle way in matters of faith, and was also seemingly prepared to take a softer approach to faith-based difference. Outward conformity, it appeared, would be enough, and certain questionable behaviours might, potentially, be overlooked. After all, Elizabeth had no wish to make windows into men's souls. Within months of Elizabeth coming to the throne, the Acts of Supremacy and Uniformity of 1559 were passed. In the case of the former, papal supremacy, which had been reintroduced by Mary I, was repealed and abolished. Elizabeth was recognised as the supreme governor of the Church of England. In the case of the latter act, that one sought to bring uniformity to the English Church. And so, a modified version of the Edwardian Prayer Book of 1552 was ordered to be used by all churches once again. And additionally, it was commanded that any person who failed to attend the state church on Sundays and holy days would be issued with a fine. However, the Act also ordered that many of the, quote, ornaments of traditional worship should be retained and be in use. As for the frankly inflammatory and dangerous question with regards to the state or status of the bread and wine during the communion, namely whether it remained simply symbolic or was in fact transubstantiated to become the literal body and blood of Christ, the words of the Elizabethan prayer book were ambiguous enough to theoretically permit either interpretation to stand. Also under Elizabeth, the heresy laws of her sister were repealed. And now, religious dissenters are not going to be popular with their queen, but now they also aren't going to be persecuted to the extent that other individuals would have been during the reign of Mary I. So, no side gets exactly what they want, and so there are going to be rumblings of discontent, but seemingly enough people got enough of what they wanted to allow them to hold the peace, at least for a while. The real pressing problems when they emerged would come from beyond England's borders. In 1568, following her forced abdication, Mary Queen of Scots fled into England. Elizabeth's Roman Catholic kinswoman already had a living infant son, one whom she had been forced to leave behind her to act as King of Scots. There were many, both at home and abroad, who viewed Mary as the heir apparent to the throne, with Elizabeth's own apparent reticence to marry and produce an heir of her own body, making Mary's accession seem all the more likely. It was thus just a waiting game. The problem was that it was feared that for some in England, and indeed overseas, Mary was more than simply a preferred heir. For some people, she was being viewed as an ideal replacement. With this in mind, towards the end of 1569, the rebellion of the Northern Earls began. It was led by Charles Neville, Earl of Westmoreland, and by Thomas Percy, Earl of Northumberland. They called upon loyal Roman Catholics to rise up and to attempt to depose Elizabeth so that Mary could replace her and thus return England into obedience with Rome. Although the revolt was quickly put down, it must surely have raised some doubts for Elizabeth's government, if not for the Queen herself, with regard to the capacity for Roman Catholics to avoid traitorous stratagems like this in the future and remain preserved in their loyalty to the Queen. In the following year, this question would become more pressing still. In 1570, Pope Pius V issued the Regnans in Excelsis. This was a bull of excommunication against Elizabeth I. It deprived her of her, quote, pretended title to the crown. It absolved her nobles, subjects, and people of obedience to her, and it demanded that those who thought themselves loyal to Rome should disobey her orders, mandates, and laws. Make no mistake, this was a call to arms, a demand to depose and destroy Elizabeth. And so at this point, is it possible to be both anymore? To be both a devout Roman Catholic and a loyal Elizabethan? The following year, 1571, saw the failure of the so-called Ridolfi plot, which allegedly sought to assassinate Elizabeth so that Mary, Queen of Scots, could take her place. Also in 1571, Elizabeth's Parliament made it treason to refer to her as a schismatic or a heretic, to question her right to rule, or to seek or promote her death or deposition. Essentially then, promoting or acting on the Pope's 1570 bull were now made into the definition of treason. And then, the events in Paris the next year, 1572, could only have inflamed things. The targeting and killing of Protestants during the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre sent waves of terror through all the members of that branch of the faith across Europe. Before long, Roman Catholic priests who had been trained on the continent began a furtive missionary drive into Elizabethan England. From 1580, they would be joined by members of the Society of Jesus, who are perhaps more commonly known as the Jesuits. All these priests would assert that they had simply been called to risk life and limb just to serve the Roman Catholic faithful of Elizabethan England. But for the government of England, and perhaps the Queen, these individuals, especially the Jesuits, looked dangerously like a potential fighting force, or maybe a radicalising terrorist cell who were really sneaking into England with plans to assassinate Elizabeth. And honestly, I don't know what the truth is. Were these priests here simply to do the Roman Catholic rites and services for the Roman Catholic faithful in England? Or was there, as the government suspected, a side mission at play? Either way, the Tower of London soon began to fill up with these priests and with those who had harboured them. Torture was used, convictions were obtained, and executions were enacted. However, despite the fact that I think these people were ostensibly prisoners of faith or conscience, the Elizabethan state would not execute them as heretics, but rather as traitors. In 1581, Parliament passed an act to retain the Queen's Majesty's subjects in their due obedience. That obedience required them to attend the state church once a month at least, or be fined the frankly enormous sum for the time of £20. For context, £20 is more than £4,000 in today's money, and I think we can all agree and understand that for many individuals, this is going to be a nearly ruinous amount to pay once, let alone more than once if you happened to be a repeat offender. In 1583, there was the discovery and defeat of yet another plot which sought to depose Elizabeth in favour of Mary Queen of Scots. The key conspirator in this case was Sir Francis Throckmorton, from whom this plot gets its name. For Elizabeth and her government, I'm sure, Mary, in her position as a figurehead and all too frequently as a willing encourager for these plots, was fast becoming a real, dangerous problem. In 1584, Elizabeth's Privy Council drew up the Bond of Association, following the failure of this Throckmorton plot, and also in the aftermath of the successful assassination of the Dutch Protestant leader, William of Orange. The bond contained the following passage, quote, "If any such wicked attempt against her most royal person shall be taken in hand or procured, whereby any that have, may, or shall pretend title to come to this crown by the untimely death of her Majesty so wickedly procured, which God of his mercy forbid, that the same may be avenged. We do not only bind ourselves, both jointly and severally, never to allow, accept, or favour any such pretended successor, by whom or for whom any such detestable act shall be attempted or committed, as unworthy of all government in any Christian realm or civil state, but do also further vow and protest, as we are most bound, and that in the presence of the eternal and everlasting God, to prosecute such person or persons to death, with our joint and several forces, and to act the utmost revenge upon them." Many scholars view the Bond of Association, its wording and oaths, as a way for Elizabeth's leading counsellors to set an inescapable and ultimately fatal trap for Mary Queen of Scots. They thought, perhaps they knew, that she was engaged in plotting against Elizabeth. And it seems they thought, rightly as it turned out, that they could entice, perhaps entrap her into plotting in such a way that she would provide them with the proof or evidence upon which, because of the Bond of Association, they were now bound to prosecute her to death. In 1585, tensions between England and a number of Roman Catholic states in Europe, particularly Spain, began to bubble over. In the same year, an act against Jesuits and seminarists was passed. It ordered Roman Catholic priests to leave the country for good within 40 days, or to face death if and or indeed when they were discovered by the authorities. There would be another attempt to dethrone Elizabeth in 1586. This time, it was as part of the Babington plot. But unbeknownst to these plotters, Elizabeth's leading advisors knew everything that was being discussed, because they had intercepted and decoded all of their letters, some of which had been written by Mary Queen of Scots herself. Eventually, they found, some say they forced or even fabricated, a part of a letter in which Mary told the plotters to set to work. And so Mary was caught. And due to the earlier Bond of Association, she would be destroyed. Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed on the 8th of February, 1587, at Fotheringay Castle. Mary's death fueled a pre-existing animosity, which arguably was being stoked by the damage that was being done to Spanish and Portuguese shipping by Elizabethan privateers, and also by England's continued interference in their dealings in the Low Countries. because England was supporting the Dutch Protestants who were there. All of this brought the threat of invasion to England's doorstep. In 1588, the Spanish Armada set out to invade and conquer England, and had it been successful, I believe that Elizabeth would have been killed almost at once, and that then her people would have been subject to Inquisition. Protestants would have been hunted down and would have been forced to either recant or suffer burning at the stake for their heresy. For the rest of the reign, Roman Catholic priests continued to slip into England and move about on their secret missionary work. Meanwhile, the state continued to try and seek them out, imprison, torture, and execute them. But despite all of this, in English Reformations, Religion, Politics and Society under the Tudors, Christopher Hay states that, quote, "English Catholicism became a country house religion, the faith of the gentry and their dependents. At the end of Mary's reign, Catholicism had been the religion of a large majority of the English people. By the end of Elizabeth's, it was the faith of a small sect." In 1603, the bishops reported to their new king that there were 2,250,675 Church of England communicants and only 8,590 adult recusants. This was a massive underestimate, and it excluded the papists, but it indicates the scale of the Catholic community. Within 2 generations, the Catholics had dwindled to numerical insignificance. So what do you think? Did Elizabeth genuinely want to find a middle way in matters of faith? Did she want to avoid making windows into men's souls? Was there an existential threat or threats that changed how things could be done? Or was Elizabeth or her government simply looking for an excuse to U-turn so that they could assert their authority or kill their enemies? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comments section underneath this video. Or you can find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to all the other places you can find me on the internet in my description box, so please do follow me over on some or all of those so that we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, why not share it with your friends? Please also let me know you liked it by hitting the thumbs up. And please subscribe to the channel. And if you think you are subscribed, do have a little check now just to make sure that YouTube hasn't mysteriously unsubscribed you against your will, because I have heard word that it is doing so. And while you're there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, please do hit the bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button and then select all in the drop-down menu that's going to appear so that YouTube will allegedly tell you when I've next uploaded. I do hope you're going to have a great day whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.